Hi, kids. What time is it? That's right. It is story time. I didn't even have to tell you this time. I can't begin to tell you how happy I am to be here today with you guys. You know, it has just been such a wonderful experience for me to be able to spend time with you, and it's almost like having all of you here. I know I can't be with all of you at the same time, but this is kind of like the next best thing, and it really, really, really makes me feel good. Hey, okay, let's have roll call, okay? Let's start off with Cheech. Raise your hand to say here. All right. How about Talia? Oh, by the way, Talia, hey, I got your message on YouTube. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. I love you guys so much. Ariel, Juliet, Audrey, Kalea, Lauren, Aiden, JJ. Did I miss anybody? I did. Okay. Hey, great guys. Hey, look, I want to do something a little different today. Okay, let's instead of reading a book today, what I want to do is I want to tell you guys a story, and this story is going to be one of Grimm's fairy tales. Do you guys know about Grimm's fairy tales? Well, let me tell you a little bit. Way back in the 19th century, you know, that's the time between the years 1800 and 1900, there was these two guys over in Germany named Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Yeah, and they collected and wrote a lot of these folk tales that became classic, and people all over the world over the years have heard them and recited them and repeated them and taught them to their kids. And they are probably the most famous of all of the storytellers. Their folk tales then ultimately became known as fairy tales. You've heard the term fairy tales. Well, chances are many of the fairy tales that you have heard and read were from the Grimm brothers, okay? Let me just give you an example. Now, maybe you've heard of some of them and maybe you haven't. For example, how about Frog Princess? Anyone hear of that one? Hansel and Gretel. Yeah, that's Grimm's fairy tales. Rapunzel. That's one of theirs. Beauty and the Beast. Yep, they wrote that one. Little Red Riding Hood. The Three Pigs. That's one of theirs too. I mean, did you realize that? The Grimm brothers wrote The Three Pigs. Rumpelstiltskin. Sleeping Beauty. Yeah, that's a Grimm fairy tale. Even Snow White. Yeah, all of those were done by the Grimm brothers, and more. There's others. Probably some you've heard of, some you haven't. So what I want to do is I've picked one that probably some of you have already heard, and maybe some of you haven't. So to the best of my knowledge, I'm going to tell you how this works. Now, one thing about fairy tales is all the fairy tales I've ever heard or read always have happy endings. Generally, the last line in a fairy tale is, and they live happily ever after. So that gives you an idea that no matter what happens in a fairy tale, it's all going to turn out all right in the end, okay? The fairy tale I picked is Hansel and Gretel. Do you guys know that one? Huh? Okay, some of you probably do. And then again, there's some of you that probably haven't heard of Hansel and Gretel. Now, the way it goes is a long, long time ago in a land far away, there was a famine in the land. Now, a famine means the people didn't have any food and they were poor and they were hungry. All of the people in the land were hungry. And in this little house, there was this woodsman. He was a guy who, I guess, would cut wood in the forest. And he lived in this house with his two daughters and his wife. Now, his wife was actually his second wife. His first wife had passed away. So this was the stepmother of the woodsman and his two children. Did I say two daughters earlier? No, one was a girl and one was a boy. And of course, those were Hansel and Gretel. So Hansel and Gretel lived with their father and their stepmother in this little house in this area where they were very poor and very hungry. And if that wasn't bad enough, their stepmother was very mean. She didn't like Hansel and Gretel. So one day, the stepmother said to the father, "Look, we're poor. We don't have enough food to hardly feed ourselves. I want you to get rid of those kids, take them out in the forest and lose them." Well, of course, the father didn't want to do that. These were his kids. But she was insistent. That's how mean she was. She demanded, "You got to get rid of those kids." So he just really hated the idea of doing that. But at the same time, Hansel and Gretel were in their room and they were listening through the wall. And they heard this. So Hansel picked up a whole pocket full of little white stones that he had collected. He stuck them in his pocket. Just then, the wicked stepmother told the father, "Go get them and get rid of them." So the father came to the door and said, "Hansel, Gretel, come with me." So Hansel and Gretel came out of the room and they went with their father and he took them into the forest, way into the forest. But as Hansel and Gretel were walking through the forest, Hansel was dropping some of those little white stones on the trail so that he could find his way back. He was very smart, okay? But the father didn't know he was doing that, okay? So they got into the forest, and then the father ran off and left them there, and they were lost. But Hansel found one of the stones on the ground, and then another one, and he started following the stones back. And eventually, he got all the way back, and they found their house. And they went up to the door and knocked. And when the door opened, it was the stepmother. And she was angry. "How did you find your way back?" And she didn't want them back. And she was very angry. And she told him, "Go to your room. You get nothing but just bread and water." So she gave him a piece of bread and some water and sent him into their room. And she was so angry. And she talked to the father about, "You've got to do something. You've got to get rid of him." So he was very sad. He didn't want to. So he asked, "What should I do?" She said, "This time, take them deeper into the forest." So the father went to the room and said, "Hansel, Gretel, come with me." Well, Hansel didn't have any more white stones, and he didn't have any time to go get any. All he had was that piece of bread that she'd given him. So he stuffed it in his pocket, and he and Gretel followed the father out, and they walked along the path into the forest. And this time, the father took them way, way deep into the forest, so far that they would never find their way back. But Hansel took that bread out of his pocket, and he was dropping little pieces of it along the path as he went, just like he did with the stones the first time, so that he could find his way back. So this time, when they got deep into the forest, the father turned and ran and left him. Then Hansel turned around and started following the breadcrumbs. But after a few steps, he discovered the birds had come and they'd been eating the breadcrumbs. Now they were lost. They couldn't find their way back. So they started wandering around in the forest trying to find their way. And then they came and they found an opening, a clearing where there was no trees. And in the middle of the clearing was a house. But it was a strange house, a very strange house. It was made out of gingerbread and frosting and candy. They walked up to the door and they knocked on the door of the house. And remember, they hadn't eaten and they were so hungry and so skinny. And the door opened. And standing in the doorway was a witch. Oh, my. And she said, "Come on in." So they walked in. Now, this witch had two big problems. Let me tell you about these two problems that this witch had. Problem number one, the witch had very poor eyesight. She could not see very well, okay? But the other problem was an even bigger problem. The witch was a cannibal. The witch ate little kids, okay? So she saw Hansel and Gretel, but they were so skinny. They didn't hardly have any meat on them. So she grabbed Hansel and she put him in a cage. And she says, "I need to fatten you up because you're too skinny." And she made Gretel help her feed Hansel with all these cakes and cookies and stuff that she had all over the house, trying to get him fat. But Hansel didn't want to get fat. But remember, she was kind of blind and she couldn't see that he wasn't getting fat. And the way she would check to see if he was getting fat was she would reach through the bar of the cage and she would try to feel his fingers to see if they was getting fatter. But Hansel was really smart. He found an old chicken bone laying on the floor and he picked it up, and every time she reached in to feel his finger, he held the chicken bone out. Of course, she was kind of blind and she couldn't tell the difference. And she would feel that old bony chicken bone and it would say, "Oh, he's still skinny. Keep feeding him, Gretel." So anyway, while Gretel was bringing food to him, the witch went over to fire up the oven to get ready to cook him. And she was getting it nice and hot, and she had her back turned. And Gretel ran over there and pushed her into the oven and closed the door and burned her up. And then she ran over and released Hansel out of the cage. And he was free. And they started looking around the house and they found a whole bunch of gold and jewels and money. And they started piling it into bags and they had big bags of treasure, and they came out of the house and they started wandering through the woods trying to find their way. And the birds that were flying, they started following the birds. And after a while, eventually, they found their house. And they're bringing all this gold and treasure and money back to their house. And they knock on the door. And the door opens. And it's their father standing there. And he sees them. And he's so happy. And he falls down to his knees and he hugs them. And he's got all of this, they've got all this treasure. And it's, "Look what we've got, Father." And the father says, "While they were gone, the stepmother passed away. And all it is now is him and them and all of this money." And just like every fairy tale, they live happily ever after. I hope you enjoy Hansel and Gretel. Okay, well, anyway, tell you what, next time we get together, I'll get back to, let me see. Oh, here it is. Ava's Spectacular Spectacles. Now, do you know what spectacles are? I know some of you do. But those of you that don't, I want you to look it up and find out what are spectacles. We're going to talk about that next time, all right? All right. Very good. In the meantime, now, repeat after me. I am strong. I am smart. And I am loved. Believe it. Next time.